So, picture this. It's the year 1640, and you're a Chinese peasant farmer, right?
Okay.
And virtually overnight, you watch your taxes basically triple.
Yeah, which is just devastating.
Right. And the crazy thing is, the physical amount of grain you're growing, it hasn't changed at all.
Mm-hmm.
And the official tax rate that your emperor set in Beijing, that hasn't changed either. But you are suddenly financially ruined, staring down like absolute starvation.
And it's all because of a guy sitting on a throne half a world away.
Exactly. King Philip IV of Spain, who just decides one day to crack down on silver smugglers sailing out of South America.
It's wild. It is just a wild butterfly effect.
It really is. And that unseen, just intricate web of global supply chains, climate shifts, and macroeconomic collapse, that is exactly what we are dissecting today on this deep dive.
Yeah.
Because for those of you listening, our mission today is to explore this towering era of human history, the Ming Dynasty of China, which runs from 1368 to 1644.
Such a phenomenal subject to tackle.
It is. And we've got this comprehensive stack of sources for this one, right? We're pulling from historical census data, military treatises, records of global trade, and deep climate histories.
Which you really need because the Ming is, well, it's just this incredible paradox.
How so?
Well, you're looking at a state that explicitly attempted to build this perfectly isolated, unchanging, self-sufficient agrarian utopia.
Right. They just wanted to pull up the drawbridge.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the very mechanisms they put in place to ensure that isolation, that's actually what made them profoundly vulnerable to a rapidly globalizing world.
Wow.
And, to really understand how that happened for you listening, we can't just throw dates and emperors at you. We have to trace the cause and effect chronologically.
Yeah, we have to start from the ashes of the empire they replaced.
Right, the collapse of the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty in the mid-14th century.
Because, the Ming doesn't just emerge out of a vacuum. It's a direct reaction to a highly specific set of traumas.
Totally. The Mongol administration had set up this deeply hierarchical four-tiered class system.
Which legally institutionalized ethnic discrimination against the Han Chinese majority, right?
Yeah, specifically in the South. They were relegated to the absolute bottom of the social and legal hierarchy.
Which obviously creates this massive reservoir of resentment.
Right. But, systemic discrimination is often survivable for a population until you compound it with systemic economic collapse.
Oh, man.
The UN government had gotten just incredibly bloated. And to fund their military, they started aggressively printing fiat paper currency.
But without the silver or silk reserves to back it up.
Exactly.
Which triggers catastrophic hyperinflation. The paper money essentially becomes worthless overnight.
Yep. So you have this subjugated ethnic majority whose life savings have just evaporated.
And as if that's not enough to destabilize a society, the environment just completely turns against them.
The Yellow River floods.
Right. Because the Yuan administration had neglected the critical infrastructure, specifically the irrigation and flood control systems.
And the Yellow River is historically known as China's sorrow for a very good reason.
Yeah.
Its sediment load makes it incredibly prone to changing course if those levees aren't, meticulously maintained.
So in the 1840s, it floods catastrophically. It just devastates the agricultural heartland.
And the government's response is basically the spark that detonates the powder keg.
What do they do?
They conscript hundreds of thousands of starving, displaced peasants into forced labor to repair the riverbanks.
Imagine you are one of those peasants listening to this. You're already starving. Your money is completely worthless. You are legally a second-class citizen.
Right.
And now the state forces you into brutal manual labor on a riverbank.
It is the absolute perfect breeding ground for radicalization.
And that radicalization takes the form of the Red Turban Rebellion.
Yes.
Which is tied to this secret society called the White Lotus, right?
Yeah, the White Lotus is so fascinating. They provided the ideological framework for the rebellion.
Like a religious backing?
Exactly. It was a syncretic religious movement, heavily drawing on a specific sect of Buddhism that was deeply eschatological.
Meaning like end-of-the-world focus?
Right. They believed in the imminent arrival of the Maitreya, which is a future Buddha who would come to cleanse the world of suffering and restore a utopian order.
Which makes sense. When your society experiences plagues, floods, and hyperinflation...
apocalyptic messaging becomes incredibly persuasive.
Totally. And that paves the way for the ascension of our central figure, who is Zhu Yuanzing.
The future Hongwu emperor.
Yes. And his origin story, it defies belief. It's like a gritty underdog movie mixed with a mob boss ascension.
Hilarious.
He is born into absolute devastating poverty. I mean, his family literally starves to death during a drought.
Right.
He only survives by becoming a novice monk in a local Buddhist monastery, basically sweeping floors for a bowl of rice.
Then the monastery runs out of money.
Right, so he's forced to wander the countryside as a beggar for years.
And when he finally goes back, his monastery is burned down by a Yuan militia.
He has literally nothing left to lose. So, in 1352, he just joins the Red Turban rebels.
And this is where we see his sheer, ruthless political genius.
Yeah, he doesn't stay a foot soldier for long, does he?
Not at all.
Nah.
He is illiterate when he joins, but he possesses this intense strategic mind. He rapidly rises through the ranks by, co-opting existing power structures.
He marries the foster daughter of a prominent rebel commander.
Exactly, which instantly elevates his social standing. And then he aggressively recruits Confucian scholars to his side.
Which seems like a weird move for a peasant rebel.
Well, it's crucial. He realizes that you can't govern an empire with a religious doomsday cult.
Oh, right.
You need the traditional bureaucratic elite to actually run the logistics of an army and eventually a state.
So he pivots. He transitions from this rebellious warlord into an institutional leader. And he methodically eliminates all his rival rebel factions, because it wasn't just him against the Mongols, right?
No, as the Yuan dynasty retreats north, it's a chaotic free-for-all among different rebel groups fighting for supremacy.
Which culminates in 1363 with the Battle of Lake Poyang.
Which is frequently cited as the largest naval battle in human history.
Which is just crazy to think about.
The scale is almost incomprehensible for the 14th century. Zhu Yuanzhang is facing his primary rival, Chen Yuyang.
The leader of the Han rebel faction.
Right, and the setting is Lake Poyang, this massive body of water in Jiangxi province. Chen brings a force estimated at 650,000 men.
650,000.
Yeah, and they're on these towering, multi-story floating fortresses. They're essentially huge floating castles clad in iron plates.
Wow. And what did Zuan have?
His force is vastly outnumbered. He's got about 200,000 sailors, and his ships are significantly smaller.
But smaller means more maneuverable, right?
Exactly.
I look at this battle, and it instantly reminds me of the defeat of the Spanish Armada. You have these massive, lumbering behemoths facing a smaller, agile force that knows how to exploit the environment.
Yep. Zhu basically waits for the wind to shift.
And then he unleashes fire ships.
The mechanics of those fire ships were devastatingly effective. They loaded small, fast boats with reeds, gunpowder, and sulfur.
Set them ablaze.
Set them on fire and sailed them directly into the densely packed Han fleet.
And because Chen's huge ships were chained together to create stable platforms for the troops?
They couldn't evade.
Oh.
The fire just swept through the entire armada. It's total annihilation.
So Zhu Yunzhang secures control of the wealthy Yangtze River Valley. And then, conveniently, the nominal head of the Red Turbans dies in a shipwreck while traveling as Zhu's guest.
Very convenient.
Very. So with no one left to oppose him, Zhu marches north in 1368, captures Beijing, forces the last Mongol emperor to flee into the steppes, and declares the founding of the Ming Dynasty.
And he takes the title Hongwu, meaning vastly martial.
But, as we know, taking power and actually designing a functional state are two very different things.
Entirely different. And to understand the architecture of the Ming state, you have to understand the deep psychological scars of its founder.
Right, because he grew up in total trauma.
Hongwu spent his formative years watching society collapse under the weight of hyperinflation, bureaucratic corruption, and famine.
So he develops a pathological obsession with control and stability?
Exactly. He hates merchants and commerce. He views them as parasitic forces that just create economic volatility.
So what's his goal?
He wants to freeze Chinese society in an idealized agrarian past.
He basically attempts to architect a massive static farming commune.
That is exactly what it was.
I mean, every citizen is legally bound to their hereditary occupation. If your father was a soldier, you are a soldier. If he was a farmer, you are a farmer.
And you cannot travel more than a few miles from your home without official documentation.
It's an extreme form of micromanagement. And the centerpiece of this whole vision is his military structure, right? The Waisua system.
Yeah, the Weisuo system.
Yeah.
It is a brilliant idea in theory, but a complete sociological disaster in practice.
Okay, unpack that for us.
So Hongwu establishes a standing army of over 1 million men. But he doesn't want the state to pay for it.
Of course not.
So he creates hereditary military colonies. The idea is that these units will be stationed on the frontiers, given tracts of land, and they'll farm their own food during peacetime and fight during wartime.
making the military entirely self-sufficient.
Exactly.
It honestly reminds me of a modern company offering equity instead of a salary, just hoping the employees will fund themselves through their own productivity.
That's a great analogy.
But how does that actually play out on the ground? I'm guessing not well.
It degrades rapidly. Within a single generation, the officers commanding these units realize they have unchecked local power.
Oh no.
So they begin confiscating the land from the regular soldiers, forcing those soldiers to work as their personal tenant farmers.
So military readiness just plummets.
Completely. The soldiers are impoverished, they're exhausted from farming for corrupt officers, desertion rates skyrocket.
So the million-man army just sort of rots from the inside.
By the mid-Ming period, the paper strength of the military was a total fiction. The state actually had to start paying silver to hire mercenaries to fight their wars.
Wow. That's the fatal flaw of trying to design a perfect, unchanging system, right? You ignore human nature and institutional decay.
Precisely.
And Hongu's demand for absolute control doesn't just apply to the peasants. It fundamentally rewrites the top levels of the government.
Yes, in 1380, he suspects his chancellor, a man named Hu Weiyang, of plotting a coup.
And Hongu doesn't just execute the guy. He initiates a purge that lasts over a decade.
A horrific purge.
The sources estimate roughly 30,000 to 100,000 people tied to Hu's faction were executed.
But the structural change he makes is even more profound. He abolishes the chancellery entirely.
And for context, for you listening, the chancellery was essentially the executive branch of the bureaucracy.
Right. It was the prime minister's office.
It filtered information, synthesized policy, and managed the 6 ministries' personnel, revenue, rights, war, justice, and public works.
And by abolishing it, Hongwu mandates that all 6 ministries report directly to him.
So he makes himself the sole executive officer of an empire of millions of people.
He was reportedly reading hundreds of memorials and making hundreds of administrative decisions every single day.
Which he could handle because he was this workaholic with terrifying stamina.
Right, but he designed a centralized system that required a genius autocrat to function.
So when lesser emperors inherit this system,
The entire state apparatus just seizes up.
which sets the stage perfectly for a spectacular succession crisis.
Oh, absolutely.
Hongwu tries to architect this perfect transition of power, right? He bypasses his battle-hardened, powerful sons in favor of his young grandson, the Jianwen emperor.
But as soon as Hongwu dies in 1398, the system immediately fractures.
Because the grandson knows his uncles are a threat.
Right. The Jianwen emperor recognizes the existential threat posed by his uncles, particularly Zhu Di, the Prince of Yan.
Because Zhu Di commands these massive, battle-hardened armies on the northern frontier in Beijing.
Exactly. So Jianwen initiates a policy of stripping his uncles of their military titles, forcing them into house arrest, or forcing them to commit suicide.
He basically pushes Zhu Di into a corner.
And Zhu Di responds by launching a massive civil war.
Under the pretext of rescuing the young emperor from corrupt advisors, naturally.
Naturally. It's a brutal 3-year conflict that ends with Zhu Di's forces breaching the capital in Nanjing.
The imperial palace burns to the ground, and the Jianwen emperor disappears into the flames, supposedly dead.
And Zhu Di claims the throne as the Yongle emperor.
And this brings us to a radical pivot in Ming policy. Because historians often call Yongle's reign the second founding of the dynasty, right?
It's a completely accurate designation, because Yongle completely dismantles his father's vision of an isolated agrarian state.
Because he's insecure.
Yes. Yongle is a usurper. He is deeply insecure about his legitimacy, having basically killed his nephew to take the throne.
Right.
So to compensate, he decides to project imperial power on a scale the world had literally never seen.
He needs to physically manifest his legitimacy.
Exactly. Beginning with relocating the primary capital from Nanjing back to his power base in the North Beijing.
And the logistics of building the new Beijing, specifically the Forbidden City, are just staggering.
Oh, they are mind-boggling.
We are talking about hundreds of thousands of artisans and laborers conscripted for over a decade, and the sheer material engineering.
Right.
They were sourcing enormous single-piece stone blocks for the palace carvings. I mean, how did they even transport multi-ton boulders across the country in the early 1400s without motorized transport?
They actually utilized the winter climate.
Wait, how?
To move the massive stones from quarries outside Beijing, laborers dug wells along the transport route. In the dead of winter, they poured water on the dirt paths to create smooth ice roads.
Ice roads.
Yeah, and then they manually dragged the stones on sledges over the ice.
That is insane.
And they also sourced extremely rare Nanmu wood from the old-growth forests of southwestern China.
floating massive logs down the Yangtze and up the Grand Canal to Beijing.
The mobilization of resources was absolute?
But the Forbidden City was just his domestic flex, right? His geopolitical projection was even more ambitious?
Yes. The treasure fleets. Commanded by Admiral Zheng He.
This is one of my favorite parts of history. The Zheng He voyages are a total marvel of maritime engineering.
Starting in 1405, the Ming state commissioned thousands of vessels.
And the largest of these, the treasure ships, were reportedly up to 134 meters long, featuring 9 masts.
And they utilized highly advanced naval technology for the era.
Like what?
Like watertight bulkheads that prevented the ship from sinking if the hull was breached, and balanced rudders that made these absolute behemoths remarkably maneuverable.
And they sailed all across the Indian Ocean, reaching India, the Arabian Peninsula, the eastern coast of Africa.
Yeah, it was an incredible reach.
And this always raises a massive historical hypothetical, right? Okay, let's unpack this for a second. You have the Ming Dynasty in the early 1400s. They possess the most technologically advanced, dominant naval force on the planet.
Right.
A century later, smaller, far cruder European ships would begin colonizing the globe. Why didn't the Ming colonize? Why did they just pack it up and go home?
It requires a fundamental shift in how we perceive statecraft.
Okay.
The European model of exploration was driven by mercantilism and resource scarcity. They needed spices, gold, new markets.
But the Ming didn't.
No, the Ming economy was overwhelmingly self-sufficient. The voyages of Zheng were not about economic extraction.
What were they about?
They were about political extortion within the framework of the tributary system.
Right, because they viewed China as the absolute center of the civilized universe.
Exactly. The goal of the fleet was to arrive at foreign ports with overwhelming, terrifying grandeur.
Dispensing lavish gifts of silk and porcelain.
And demanding that those local rulers send envoys back to Beijing to formally acknowledge the Ming emperor's supremacy.
So it was about reinforcing a geopolitical hierarchy where the Ming emperor was the undisputed sovereign of the world.
It was a projection of prestige, not an attempt to conquer or settle foreign soil.
But projecting that level of prestige is astronomically expensive.
Hugely expensive.
And once the Yongle emperor dies, the bureaucratic pushback is immediate. The scholar officials look at these voyages and see a colossal waste of silver and timber.
They argue that the real threat to the empire isn't in the Indian Ocean. It's right on their northern doorstep.
And they were entirely correct.
Yes. The northern frontier was always the true existential threat to the Ming.
Because the Mongols had never truly been eliminated, they had just retreated into the steppes, fractured, and waited.
And by the 1440s, a new confederation emerged under the leadership of the Oirat Mongols, commanded by a highly capable leader named Isun.
Which sets the stage for one of the most bizarre and catastrophic failures of leadership in Chinese history.
The Tumu Crisis.
The Tumu Crisis of 1449. The Zhengtong Emperor is on the throne. He's a young man heavily influenced by his chief eunuch, Wang Zhen.
And Wang Zhen is the classic sycophant. He completely lacks military experience.
But he convinces the emperor that he should personally lead a massive expeditionary force beyond the Great Wall to crush the Oirats.
The logistics of the campaign were doomed from the exact start.
Because Wang Zhen dictates the marching routes based on his own personal vanity, right?
Yes. He specifically routed the massive army through his hometown just so he could show off to the locals.
Which severely delays their progress.
Right. The army becomes exhausted. Their supply lines are stretched incredibly thin.
And crucially, they are cut off from their water sources by Isun's highly mobile cavalry.
So the Ming army is utterly routed. 500,000 men are slaughtered or scattered.
And then the unthinkable happens. The Zhengtong Emperor is captured alive on the battlefield.
Which, for Isun, seems like the ultimate geopolitical jackpot.
Right. He has the sovereign of the Ming Dynasty sitting in his camp.
He assumes he can dictate any terms he wants, demanding vast territories, unfettered trade access, astronomical ransoms of silver and silk.
But this is where we see the intense, ruthless functionality of the Ming bureaucratic machine.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, if a European monarch was captured in battle during the Middle Ages, the kingdom usually emptied its treasury to pay the ransom.
But the Ming defense minister, Yu Qian, basically acts as the institutional immune system.
He looks at the hostage situation and makes a chillingly pragmatic calculation.
Yu Qian understands that the stability of the state is paramount. It far supersedes the life of a single emperor.
Wow.
So he rallies the court in Beijing, fortifies the capital against a potential Oirat siege, and pushes through an emergency decree.
They elevate the captured emperor's younger brother to the throne as the new Jingtai emperor.
And they basically send a message back to the Mongols saying, we don't negotiate with hostage takers. Also, that guy you're holding, he doesn't work here anymore.
That is so cold.
It is, but it completely neutralized Asen's leverage.
Right. The captured emperor goes from being an invaluable asset to a massive logistical burden for the Oirats.
Eventually, realizing he could extract absolutely nothing of value, Asen simply releases the Zhengtan emperor back to China.
Which creates an incredibly awkward family reunion.
Very awkward.
The new emperor immediately places his returning brother under strict house arrest in the southern palace.
Where he stays for 7 years, until he finally orchestrates a coup and reclaims his throne.
But looking past all that palace intrigue, the trauma of the Tumu crisis fundamentally rewires the DNA of the Ming state.
The psychological shift is profound. The dynasty permanently abandons the expansive, outward-looking posture of the Yongle era.
They realize they cannot project power outward when their absolute center is so vulnerable.
Exactly. The state adopts a profound siege mentality.
And the physical manifestation of that shift is the massive fortification of the northern border, resulting in the Great Wall as we visually recognize it today.
Right.
And, I always used to picture the Great Wall as just a static, giant brick barrier, like a huge, ancient do not disturb sign spanning the mountains.
But that completely undermines the technological sophistication of the structure.
Yeah, clarify that for us, because it wasn't just a wall.
Not at all. To view it merely as a wall is to misunderstand its entire function. It was a highly integrated, high-speed communication and logistics network.
The watchtowers.
Exactly. The watchtowers were designed as a complex early warning system.
How did the signaling actually work across such vast distances?
They utilized smoke signals during the day and fire beacons at night.
Using wolf dung, right.
Yeah, they relied heavily on wolf dung for the fires because it burns densely and creates a thick, vertical column of smoke that is visible from miles away.
That's brilliant.
If a Mongol raiding party approached a specific sector, a tower guard would light a beacon. The adjacent tower would see it and light theirs.
A relay system.
Yes. This relay system could transmit military intelligence across hundreds of miles in a matter of hours,
allowing the Central Command in Beijing to deploy targeted troop reinforcements to the exact point of incursion long before the enemy could breach the inner defenses. It's basically an information highway built of stone.
That's a great way to put it.
But it also represents the Ming closing their doors, right? They implement the Heijin policies, heavily restricting maritime trade and trying to seal the empire off from foreign influence.
They tried.
Right, they tried. Because here is the incredible paradox of the Ming Dynasty. While the state was militarizing its borders and turning inward politically, the society inside those walls was experiencing a spectacular economic and cultural golden age.
The demographic expansion during the mid to late Ming is staggering.
How staggering.
To contextualize this, early Ming censuses in the late 1300s put the population around 65 million.
Okay.
By the early 1600s, demographic historians estimate the population surged to anywhere between 160 million and 200 million people.
Wait, really? How does an agrarian empire nearly triple its population without acquiring massive tracts of new arable land?
The answer is the Columbian Exchange.
So despite the government's attempts to restrict foreign trade, they couldn't stop global biological exchange.
Right. European traders, specifically the Spanish and Portuguese, were bringing entirely new crops from the Americas to East Asia.
Like what?
Sweet potatoes, maize, and peanuts. And this was a revolutionary agricultural paradigm shift.
Why were those specific crops so important?
Well, traditional Chinese staples like wet field rice require very specific, highly irrigated valleys.
Right.
And wheat requires temperate plains. But the sweet potato and maize are incredibly hardy.
So you can grow them anywhere.
Exactly. They can be cultivated in poor, rocky soil, on mountainsides, and in arid climates where traditional crops would just fail.
So they effectively unlocked millions of acres of previously unfarmable land.
Yes, and it created a massive caloric surplus, which fundamentally reduced the frequency of regional famines.
And surplus food means surplus energy, which fuels rapid urbanization.
Cities like Suzhou and Hangzhou became booming metropolises, driven by immense commercial manufacturing in silk, cotton, and porcelain.
And with that wealth comes an explosion of scientific and technological innovation. It's not just art and poetry. They were pushing the boundaries of engineering and medicine.
They really were.
I mean, a quirky example that I love, the modern bristle toothbrush.
Oh, yeah.
Before this, people literally chewed on twigs. But in 1498, Ming innovators attached stiff, coarse hairs plucked from a pig's neck to a bone handle.
It's the exact blueprint we still use today.
Except, thankfully, we use nylon now instead of pig hair.
Very true. But the innovations were far more profound than oral hygiene. The Ming era witnessed major leaps in empirical science.
Most notably through the work of Li Shizhen in the 16th century.
Right. He was a physician and pharmacologist who spent decades compiling the Benkao Gangmu.
Which is this exhaustive medical encyclopedia.
It detailed nearly 2,000 medicinal substances. And what's crucial about Li Shizhen is his methodology.
He didn't just blindly copy ancient texts, did he?
No, he actively traveled. He interviewed practitioners and empirically tested the efficacy and toxicity of herbs and minerals.
And they were tackling diseases that were ravaging the rest of the world. The sources document that late Ming physicians were actually utilizing an early form of smallpox inoculation.
Yes.
Which is mind-blowing. How did they actually administer it centuries before the modern vaccine was invented?
The practice was called variolation.
Okay.
It involved taking infectious material, specifically the scabs, from a patient recovering from a mild case of smallpox.
Oh, gross.
Yeah, grinding the scabs into a fine powder, and then blowing it up the nostril of a healthy person using a silver tube.
That sounds terrifying by modern standards. You were literally blowing a deadly virus into someone's respiratory system.
It carried significant risk, absolutely. But the mechanism is sound.
How so?
By introducing the virus through the nasal mucosa rather than naturally through the respiratory tract, it generally resulted in a localized, much milder infection.
Which triggered the body's immune response.
Exactly, conferring lifelong immunity. It was an incredibly sophisticated understanding of virology, developed purely through observation and empirical practice.
The military tech of this era is equally wild. There's this 14th century treatise called the Hulongjing that outlines weapons that sound like they belong in the 20th century.
Yes, the early firearms and explosives.
We aren't just talking about basic gunpowder. We are talking about complex mechanical triggers.
The treatise details early landmines used to secure defensive perimeters.
But instead of relying on a simple burning fuse, which is highly unreliable in combat, they developed a mechanical wheel-lock system.
Right. The mine was buried, and a system of weights and pins was connected to a steel wheel resting against flint.
So when an enemy stepped on the trigger,
the weights dropped, spinning the steel against the flint, showering sparks into a gunpowder train that detonated the hidden explosive.
That is so advanced. And they also engineered aerodynamic rockets, two-stage rockets.
The fire dragon issuing from the water?
Yes. The treatise describes it as a bamboo tube shaped like a dragon. It was propelled through the air by large, solid propellant booster rockets strapped to the outside.
And once those boosters burned out, the fuse ignited a swarm of smaller rockets inside the tube,
which shot out of the dragon's mouth into the enemy ranks. It's essentially early cruise missile technology.
But you know, this era wasn't just a revolution in technology. It was a revolution in how the individual viewed themselves within society.
Which brings us to philosophy.
Right. For centuries, the intellectual foundation of the Chinese bureaucracy was Neo-Confucianism.
Which was incredibly rigid, right? It was almost like a strict corporate compliance handbook for morality.
That's a highly apt comparison. Orthodox Neo-Confucianism taught that moral truth was found by meticulously investigating external things and studying ancient texts.
Right.
It established a rigid hierarchical worldview where scholars and officials were at the top, and merchants, who supposedly produced nothing but merely moved goods, were at the very bottom.
But in the 16th century, a scholar named Wang Yangming fundamentally disrupts this ideology.
He introduces the philosophy of innate knowing.
And what is the core mechanism of his argument?
Wang Yangming argued that moral truth isn't external, it's innate.
Like inside you.
Yes. Every single person, whether a highly educated scholar or an illiterate merchant, is born with a perfect moral compass.
Wow.
And crucially, he argued that knowing is useless without doing. True knowledge is action.
It's basically the 16th century equivalent of move fast and break things.
Yeah. It radically empowers the individual.
If moral truth is inside me, I don't need to defer entirely to the rigid hierarchy of the state.
Exactly. It provided a philosophical justification for personal ambition. It allowed merchants, who were traditionally marginalized, to view their commercial success not as a moral failing, but as a valid expression of their innate potential.
So this philosophy fueled the booming commercial culture of the late Ming. People were reading popular novels, they're wearing luxurious silk fashions, and openly pursuing wealth.
They're publishing newspapers with movable type, like the Peking Gazette in 1582.
But, and this is the huge but, this hyper-commercial, vibrant society is operating underneath a government that was designed by Hongwu to be a static, micromanaged agrarian commune.
Right. The architecture of the state simply could not handle the complexity of the society it was governing.
And this massive institutional disconnect comes to a head during the reign of the Wanli Emperor in the late 16th century.
The Wanli Emperor's reign is the ultimate case study in the vulnerability of absolute autocracy.
Because, if your entire bureaucratic system is designed so that every major decision must funnel through one single executive, what happens when that executive simply refuses to work?
Wanli essentially goes on a multi-decade labor strike.
He just ghosts his own empire.
Pretty much. Early in his reign, he was relatively engaged, but he quickly became disgusted by the toxic factionalism of his scholar officials.
The bureaucracy had basically derailed into endless moral purity tests, right?
Exactly. Factions within the civil service were constantly impeaching, investigating, and attacking each other over minor ideological differences. It was paralyzing state operations.
So Wanli just checks out.
Completely.
He retreats deep into the inner sanctum of the Forbidden City. He stops attending morning state audiences. He refuses to read official memorials.
He even refuses to appoint replacements when top ministers die or retire, leaving entire departments completely unstaffed.
But an empire of 150 million people doesn't just stop generating administrative needs just because the emperor is sulking.
No, the vacuum of power has to be filled.
And the only people who had physical access to the reclusive emperor were his personal servants, the palace eunuchs.
The eunuchs are such a fascinating and, frankly, controversial element of Chinese history.
Yeah, because Hongwu had explicitly tried to ban them from holding political power. He even hung iron plaques in the palace strictly forbidding eunuch interference in state affairs.
But why did they invariably rise to become this shadow government?
Yeah, how does that always happen?
The power of the eunuchs derived entirely from their proximity to the emperor and their institutional isolation.
Meaning they had no outside loyalties.
Right. Because they were castrated, they could not have families. They couldn't establish hereditary dynasties to challenge the throne.
So in the eyes of the emperor, they were entirely dependent extensions of his own will.
Exactly. When the civil bureaucracy became hostile and unmanageable, emperors naturally leaned on the eunuchs to bypass all the red tape.
So by the time Wanli isolates himself, the eunuchs become the ultimate gatekeepers.
Yes. If a civil official needed a document signed, they had to bribe a powerful eunuch just to walk that piece of paper into the inner palace.
And this systemic corruption reaches its terrifying zenith in the 1620s, right? Under the Tianqi emperor with a dictator eunuch named Wei Zongxian.
Wei Zongxian is a nightmare figure in this history. He effectively usurped the imperial prerogative.
He took absolute control of the Eastern Depot, which was the Ming secret police force.
And he weaponized it. He used it to systematically purge his political rivals.
Specifically the Donlin faction, right. A group of reform-minded scholars who dared to criticize his corruption.
He didn't just fire them. He had them arrested, horribly tortured in secret prisons, and beaten to death.
And his megalomania was just off the charts. He ordered local officials to build grand temples in his honor across the empire while he was still alive.
Siphoning funds meant for military defense and imperial infrastructure.
He fundamentally crippled the civil service, driving out the most competent administrators.
And he did this at the absolute worst possible moment in history.
Because while the Ming court was consuming itself in this factional bloodletting, a massive, unseen macroeconomic crisis was quietly destroying the foundation of the empire.
Right. This is where the story pivots from palace intrigue to global economics.
The fate of this massive, supposedly self-sufficient Chinese empire becomes inextricably linked to silver mines in South America.
Which sounds crazy, but to understand how that happened, we have to look at how the Ming taxed its citizens.
Okay, let's break that down.
Initially, taxes in the Ming were collected in kind, meaning peasants paid their taxes in grain, textiles, or labor.
And the government tried to facilitate commerce by printing paper money, the great Ming treasure note.
But as we discussed with the Yuan dynasty, fiat currency only works if the state rigorously controls the money supply.
Which they didn't. They printed wildly, the paper money suffered massive hyperinflation, and the public completely lost faith in it.
So the entire economy organically rejected the state currency. They reverted to using precious metals, specifically silver, for major transactions,
while using copper coins for daily low-level peasant trade.
The critical flaw in this organic shift was geological. China did not possess sufficient domestic silver mines to lubricate a massive, booming commercial economy of nearly 200 million people.
They had an insatiable demand for silver.
And right on cue, the European colonial powers arrive.
The Portuguese secure a trading post in Macau in 1557. The Spanish conquer the Philippines and establish Manila as a global trade hub in 1571.
And crucially, the Spanish had just discovered Potosi in modern-day Bolivia.
Which was basically a literal mountain of silver.
Yes. And the mechanics of this early global trade network are fascinating. The Spanish subjected indigenous populations in the Americas to horrific forced labor to extract millions of ounces of silver.
They loaded that silver onto the Manila galleons, sailed across the Pacific to the Philippines,
And traded almost all of it to Chinese merchants in exchange for highly prized Ming silk, porcelain, and tea.
So it was this massive arterial flow of silver pumping directly into the Chinese economy.
Exactly. And the Ming government, seeing this wealth, makes a fateful administrative decision.
Right. In the 1580s, under the Grand Secretary Zhang Zhuzheng, they institute the single whip reform.
This reform consolidated a dizzying array of land taxes, labor drafts, and miscellaneous fees into a single, unified tax.
Which sounds efficient.
It does. But crucially, it mandated that this tax must be paid in silver.
And right there, they signed their own death warrant.
Yes, they did.
Think about it. They tied the fundamental tax base of their agrarian society to a foreign maritime supply chain over which they had absolutely no political or military control.
As long as the Spanish galleons kept arriving, the system functioned perfectly.
But if that global supply chain breaks, the empire starves.
Which brings us to the perfect storm of the early 17th century.
The Ming Dynasty is simultaneously hit by three catastrophic, uncontrollable forces: climate change, global macroeconomic shock, and pandemic.
Let's start with the climate. We enter a period known as the Little Ice Age.
Average global temperatures drop significantly.
And for an agrarian society, a drop in average temperature is devastating. It dramatically shortens the growing season.
So in northern China, the frost arrived earlier and left later.
Crops failed year after year. The rivers froze solid. You had widespread systemic famines.
And the government granaries, which were supposed to buffer against these exact scenarios,
Have been emptied by eunuch corruption and military spending.
wow. And just as millions of peasants are starving, the economic floor collapses. The silver shock.
In the 1630s, King Philip V of Spain realized that the massive outflow of silver to China was draining the Spanish treasury and fueling intense smuggling operations.
So he implements severe restrictions on the galleon trade out of Acapulco to Manila, trying to force the silver back to Europe.
And simultaneously, the newly established Tokugawa shogunate in Japan, which was another major source of silver for China, began severely restricting foreign trade to consolidate their own power.
The global silver spigot is just turned off.
Completely. The supply of silver in China plummets.
And when something becomes scarce, its value skyrockets.
We have to break down the macroeconomic math here because it explains exactly why the peasants rebelled.
Okay, lay it out for us.
The peasant economy operated on a bimetallic system. A farmer sold his harvested grain in the local market for copper coins,
Right.
but the state, under the single whip reform, demanded taxes be paid in silver.
And the historical exchange rate was relatively stable, right? Roughly 1,000 copper coins bought 1 ounce of silver.
Yes, but when the silver supply dried up, the exchange rate shattered. By 1640, it took 2,000 copper coins to buy that same ounce of silver.
Double.
And by 1643, it took 3,000 copper coins.
Think about the terrifying reality of that math for a farmer listening to this. The official tax rate hasn't changed. But because silver is now 3 times more expensive relative to the copper you earn, your tax burden has effectively tripled.
You have to sell 3 times as much grain just to acquire the silver to pay the tax collector.
But you can't grow 3 times as much grain because the Little Ice Age has destroyed your crops.
It is an inescapable mathematical trap.
The peasants are forced to sell their tools, their land, and in horrific cases, their own children into slavery just to avoid being tortured by the tax collectors.
And on top of all of this, the final horseman of the apocalypse arrives. Disease.
Because the massive displacement of starving refugees created the perfect vector for disease.
From 1633 to 1644, a devastating epidemic known as the Great Plague swept through northern China.
The mortality rates are hard to verify, but local gazetteers from the period provide horrifying accounts.
Some regions reported that 90% of the local population perished. Entire villages were emptied.
You have a population that is starving, freezing, dying of plague, and being squeezed for taxes they literally cannot pay.
The social contract is completely broken.
Unpaid soldiers desert the army, join up with starving peasants, and form massive rebel bands.
And the most formidable of these rebel leaders was Li Zicheng.
And he perfectly encapsulates the failure of the Ming state, doesn't he?
He really does. He wasn't born a rebel. He was a minor government employee. He worked as a post station attendant in Shaanxi province.
But when the bankrupt Ming government decided to slash the postal budget to save money, Li Zicheng lost his job. It's the ultimate irony. In trying to balance the budget, the state fired the exact man who would eventually burn the state to the ground.
Yep. Li Zicheng forms a massive rebel army, capitalizing on the absolute rage of the peasantry.
Because he promises to abolish the oppressive grain taxes.
Right. And by the spring of 1644, the Ming military is completely disintegrated, and Li Zicheng's army marches on Beijing.
The fall of Beijing in April 1644 is just a profound geopolitical tragedy.
It is. The Zhengzhen emperor, the last ruler of the Ming, is isolated in the Forbidden City. His ministers have fled or are preparing to surrender to the rebels.
He rings the bells to summon his court, and literally no one answers.
It's a haunting image.
The emperor of a dynasty that ruled for 276 years, built the Forbidden City, launched the treasure fleets. He walks out of his palace into the imperial gardens on Jingshan Hill.
Accompanied only by a single loyal eunuch.
And he hangs himself from a tree, biting his own finger to write a final decree in blood on his silk garments, blaming his officials for the collapse, but asking the rebels not to harm the common people.
But the tragedy doesn't end with Li Zicheng taking the throne.
No, because Li's rebel dynasty, the Shun, is incredibly short-lived.
The collapse of the Ming internal order created a vacuum that drew in an external apex predator.
The Manchus.
Right. For decades, the Manchu people north of the Great Wall had been unifying their tribes and building a highly organized, militarized state.
Eventually declaring themselves the Qing dynasty.
And they had been raiding the Ming borders for years, just waiting for a moment of critical weakness.
And that moment is delivered to them by a Ming border general named Wu Sungui.
Wu was commanding a formidable Ming army stationed at Shanhai Pass,
which is the heavily fortified eastern terminus of the Great Wall, literally right where the wall meets the sea.
Now, Wu Sangui is faced with an impossible strategic dilemma. Li Zicheng has just taken Beijing, his emperor is dead, and the massive rebel army is marching toward him from the south.
And to his north are the fearsome Manchu eight-banner armies, just waiting for a chance to breach the wall.
Wu calculates that he cannot defeat both, and he views Li Zicheng's rebels as illegitimate, uncultured bandits who have defiled the capital.
So he makes one of the most consequential decisions in world history.
He opens the gates of Shanhai Pass.
He literally invites the Manchus through the Great Wall.
He forms an alliance with the invaders, and the combined Manchu and Ming loyalist forces absolutely obliterate Li Zicheng's rebel army at the Battle of Shanhai Pass.
The Manchus sweep into Beijing. But, surprise, surprise, they don't hand power back to the Ming.
No, they claim the mandate of heaven for themselves.
And it's crucial to understand how they justified this politically, right?
The mandate of heaven wasn't a divine right of kings that lasted forever. It was a revocable contract.
The philosophy held that heaven bestows the right to rule on a just and competent leader.
Right. And if a dynasty becomes corrupt, if they fail to protect the people, heaven withdraws the mandate,
signaling its displeasure through natural disasters, famines, and plagues, all of which the late Ming experienced in absolute abundance.
So the Manchus argue, look at the Ice Age, look at the plagues, look at the rebel bandits. The Ming clearly lost mandate. We are here to restore cosmic and social order.
And they established the Qing Dynasty, which would rule China all the way until 1912.
When we synthesize the entire arc of the Ming Dynasty, the historical irony is just staggering.
It really is. Hung Wu engineered a state designed to be completely impervious to change.
He banned maritime travel. He tried to eliminate the merchant class. He tied the military to the soil.
He wanted a perfectly static, isolated agrarian commune.
But you cannot wall out the macro forces of the universe.
Right. They built the most sophisticated physical fortification in human history, the Great Wall. Yet they were ultimately destroyed by a drop in global temperatures that ruined their crops and a fluctuation in foreign silver markets that destroyed their tax base.
It proves that the most heavily fortified institution on Earth is still entirely at the mercy of unseen global supply chains.
Which is something you really have to think about even today.
The Ming collapse is a stark reminder that true resilience requires institutional agility. A system that cannot bend to environmental and economic shifts will eventually snap.
By institutionalizing their tax base in foreign silver, they surrendered their sovereignty to global markets without even realizing it.
But the idea of the Ming didn't vanish the exact moment Changzhen died on that hill.
No. When a massive institution falls, the ideological ghost of it often lingers. Even after the Manchus took Beijing, Ming loyalist forces, known as the Southern Ming, retreated south and fought a desperate decades-long resistance against the king until 1662.
And incredibly, the resistance even jumped across the ocean.
Yeah, a Ming loyalist warlord named Koxinga expelled the Dutch from Taiwan and established the Kingdom of Tunning, holding out on the island as a Ming-resistant state until 1683. Nearly 40 years after the capital fell, they were still fighting for the ghost of an empire.
It's incredible.
It really forces you to wonder, for all of you listening, when a massive defining institution finally collapses under the weight of a changing world, does the idea of it ever really die? Or does it just relocate, dig in, and wait for the tide of history to turn?